Lord Thomas Ashbury had a terrible reputation. They called him the Devil of Devonshire because he had duelled 3 men and won every time. The name had been given to him after the third duel, which was the one that made him famous. The first two had been minor affairs, gentlemen's quarrels, fought with pistols at dawn, resolved with wounds that healed and grudges that didn't. The duels had been talked about in the clubs and the drawing rooms of London with the casual interest that men of the aristocracy brought to violence performed by their own class. Regrettable, but understandable. The kind of thing that happened when honour was at stake and tempers ran hot. The third duel was different. The third duel was against the Marquis of Denton, a man 20 years Thomas's senior, a man with political connections and social influence, and the particular kind of power that made lesser men defer. The quarrel had been about a woman, a married woman, the wife of a naval officer serving in the Mediterranean, with whom both Thomas and the Marquis had been involved in circumstances that polite society described as complicated and honest people described as sordid. The duel had been fought with swords. This was Thomas's choice. He was a swordsman of exceptional ability, trained since childhood by a French fencing master his father had hired, and his skill with a blade was so far beyond the ordinary that choosing swords was, in effect, choosing the method of his opponent's defeat. The Marquis had accepted because refusing would have meant public humiliation, which, in the hierarchy of unacceptable outcomes, ranked slightly above death. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Thomas had dismantled the Marquis with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumour. Each stroke deliberate, each movement economical, the blade finding openings that the Marquis did not know he was leaving. He had not killed the Marquis. He had done something worse. He had humiliated him. He had cut the buttons from his coat, one by one, and then delivered a single slash across the cheek that would leave a scar visible for the rest of the Marquis's life, a permanent reminder that he had faced the Devil of Devonshire and lost. The name stuck. It stuck because it was accurate. Thomas Ashbury was, by any reasonable measure, a dangerous man. He was 32, tall, dark-haired, with the lean, coiled build of a natural athlete, and the particular intensity of a man who had directed his considerable intelligence not toward scholarship or governance or the management of an estate, but toward the refinement of violence. He fenced, he boxed, he rode with reckless speed, he drank with methodical determination. He moved through London society like a weather system, unpredictable, destructive, impossible to ignore. But the name was also incomplete. The Devil of Devonshire was a character, a performance, a mask that Thomas wore because the alternative was worse. The alternative was being Thomas Ashbury, the eldest son of the late Earl of Ashbury, a man who had been raised by a father whose primary method of communication was cruelty and whose primary expression of affection was silence. The Earl of Ashbury, Thomas's father, dead now for 6 years, had been a cold, precise, devastatingly effective man who had managed his estate, his family, and his emotions with the same ruthless efficiency. He had not beaten Thomas. The Earl did not beat. Beating was crude, and the Earl was never crude. He had instead perfected a system of psychological control that was, in its way, more damaging than any physical violence. He had withheld approval, systematically, comprehensively, for the entire 26 years of Thomas's life under his roof. The Earl had withheld the one thing his son needed, the acknowledgement that Thomas was worthy, that Thomas was enough, that Thomas was not, as the Earl's silence perpetually implied, a disappointment. Thomas had responded the way boys raised in that particular kind of emotional desert often respond, by becoming the thing his father feared. If the Earl wanted a gentleman, Thomas would be a devil. If the Earl wanted control, Thomas would be chaos. If the Earl wanted silence, Thomas would be noise. Spectacular, violent, impossible to ignore noise. The duels were noise. They were Thomas screaming, in the only language his class permitted, "I am here. I exist. I will not be overlooked." But the screaming, like all screaming, was exhausting. And Thomas, at 32, was tired. He was tired of the reputation, tired of the fear he saw in people's eyes, tired of the loneliness that attended being the most dangerous man in every room. The loneliness of a person who is always watched and never known, always feared and never understood. Always the devil and never Thomas. He had come to Devonshire to rest. That was the word he used when his friends in London asked why he was leaving the season early. Rest. What he meant was escape. The Ashbury estate, Thornbury Hall, was a Jacobean manor set in the green hills of South Devon, far enough from London to be forgotten and beautiful enough to be bearable. And Thomas had retreated there in the autumn of 1821 with the intention of drinking less, duelling not at all, and finding something, he did not know what, that would fill the space inside him that violence had been filling. He did not expect to find it in a bookshop. If you're new here, welcome to Jane Tells Stories, where the untold love stories of the Regency era come alive. If you love stories about women who stood their ground and the dangerous men who were transformed by it, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's continue. Miss Evelyn Grace was a quiet bookseller's daughter who had never even attended a proper ball. The bookshop was on the high street of Ashbourne, the small Devon market town nearest to the Ashbury estate. It was called Grace and Son, though the son had been Evelyn's grandfather, dead 30 years, and the business was now run by her father, Robert Grace, a small, stooped, endlessly kind man who had inherited two things from his own father: a love of books and a complete inability to manage money. Robert Grace loved books the way some men love horses or women or wine, with a passion that was irrational, consuming, and financially disastrous. He could not resist a good book. He could not pass a sale or an auction or a travelling bookseller without purchasing something, and the purchases had accumulated over 30 years into a collection that was extraordinary in its breadth and alarming in its cost. The shop was crammed, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, stacked on tables and piled in corners and arranged in a system that made sense only to Robert, who could locate any volume in the shop by a process of memory and instinct that functioned like a sixth sense. The shop made no money. This was not because the books were unsaleable. Many of them were rare and valuable. It was because Robert could not bring himself to sell the ones he loved, which was most of them. He would agree to sell a book, accept the customer's money, and then, as the customer reached for the volume, Robert would say, "Actually, I think I'll keep that one," and return the payment with an apologetic smile that his customers had learned to expect and his daughter had learned to dread. Evelyn was 23. She was the practical half of the Grace family, the half that paid the bills, managed the accounts, negotiated with suppliers, and ensured that the shop remained solvent despite her father's heroic efforts to bankrupt it. She had her father's love of books, but not his helplessness. She read voraciously, she thought deeply, and she managed the business with a competence that would have been admired in a man, and was, in a woman, largely invisible. She was not beautiful in the way that London defined beauty. She did not have the porcelain complexion, or the elaborate hairstyle, or the corseted figure that the season demanded. She was beautiful in a different way, the warm, unperformative beauty of a face that was always thinking, always observing, always engaged with the world in a direct and honest manner that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with presence. Her hair was brown, usually pinned up carelessly with whatever was handy: a pencil, a hairpin, a strip of ribbon from a book's binding. Her eyes were hazel, green in some lights, brown in others, always sharp. She had never attended a proper ball. She had never been to London. She had never worn silk or danced a waltz or been courted by a gentleman. Her world was the bookshop and the village and the green hills of Devon, and within that world she was content, not ecstatically happy, not tragically unhappy, but content in the settled, sustainable way of a person who has found work they love and a place they belong, and who does not waste energy wishing for a different life. She knew about the Devil of Devonshire. Everyone in the county knew. The return of Lord Ashbury to Thornbury Hall had been the primary topic of conversation in every pub, parlour, and market square within 20 miles. The stories preceded him: the duels, the drinking, the dangerous reputation. And the stories were, as stories usually are, simultaneously accurate and incomplete. They described what Thomas did. They did not describe why. Evelyn did not think much about the Devil of Devonshire. She had books to sell, accounts to manage, and a father whose latest acquisition, a complete set of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, purchased for twice its value from a dealer in Exeter, needed to be catalogued, shelved, and prevented from being unsold. Then the devil walked into her shop. One afternoon, the Devil of Devonshire walked into her father's tiny bookshop, looking for a rare fencing manual. He arrived on a Tuesday. The bell above the door chimed, a small, bright sound that Evelyn knew as well as her own heartbeat, having heard it 10,000 times. And she did not look up. She was on a ladder. The top shelf of the east wall, where the technical manuals were kept: navigation, architecture, medicine, military science, was being reorganized, and Evelyn was balanced on the third to last rung with an armful of books and the focused concentration of a woman who understood that looking away from a task on a ladder was a good way to end up on the floor. "I'm looking for a fencing manual," said a voice below her. The voice was deep, controlled, and carried the particular authority of a man accustomed to being attended to immediately. "Which one?" Evelyn asked, without turning around. "Angelo's, the 1763 edition. I'm told you might have it." Evelyn, standing on a ladder, told him without turning around that the book was already sold. "Sold yesterday," she said, placing a volume of maritime engineering on the top shelf with the careful precision that the shelf demanded. "To a collector in Exeter." There was a pause. The pause had a quality that Evelyn recognized, the quality of a person who was not accustomed to hearing the word sold applied to a thing they wanted. People of means did not hear sold. They heard reserved for you, or I can locate another copy, or how much would you like to pay? The word sold, final, unapologetic, unaccompanied by an offer to make alternative arrangements, was not part of their vocabulary. Thomas was used to people fearing him. He wasn't used to being ignored. "Who bought it?" The voice was sharper now, not angry, not yet. But the patience in it had thinned, the way patience thins in men who have not had much practice with it. He asked who bought it. Evelyn finally looked down at him. She looked down from the third to last rung of the ladder, an armful of books balanced against her hip, a pencil stuck through the knot of her hair, and she saw a man. Not the Devil of Devonshire. She did not know what the Devil of Devonshire looked like, because the gossip that circulated through Ashbourne dealt in stories rather than descriptions. She saw a man, tall, dark-haired. well dressed in the careless, expensive way that suggested wealth rather than taste. A face that was handsome and hard and carried, in the lines around the eyes and the set of the mouth, the particular tension of a person who was always braced for something, a blow, an insult, a challenge, and who had forgotten how to unclench. She saw his hands. They were at his sides, but they were not relaxed. The fingers were slightly curled, the tendons visible, the posture of hands that had gripped sword handles and reins and the necks of brandy bottles. They were capable hands, dangerous hands, hands that knew how to hurt. Evelyn finally looked down at him and said, "A gentleman who doesn't need another reason to spill blood." The words left her mouth before she had considered them, which was unusual for Evelyn, who generally considered everything. They were honest. They were the thoughts she had thought, unedited, unfiltered, delivered from the top of a ladder to a man she had never met with the directness of a woman who spent her days surrounded by books and had absorbed, through years of reading, the conviction that words should mean exactly what they say. Her honest answer stunned him. Thomas Ashbury stood in the bookshop and looked up at the woman on the ladder and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not anger. He was familiar with anger. It was his native language. Not shame. He was familiar with shame too, though he would not have called it that. What he felt was surprise. The genuine, disorienting, almost physical surprise of encountering a person who had looked at him and seen not the devil, not the reputation, not the performance, but the thing the performance was covering, the violence, the waste, the particular sadness of a man who had turned his intelligence toward destruction because no one had shown him how to turn it toward anything else. A gentleman who doesn't need another reason to spill blood. The sentence was 7 words long. It was the most accurate description of himself that Thomas had ever received, and it had been delivered by a woman on a ladder in a bookshop in Devon, who had not even bothered to face him when she said it. He bought a book. Not the Angelo, that was sold. A different book, selected at random from the shelf nearest the door, paid for without looking at the price, carried out of the shop in a hand that was, for the first time in years, uncertain of what it was holding. He went home. He sat in the library at Thornbury Hall and looked at the book. It was a volume of Wordsworth's poetry, which was possibly the least likely purchase the Devil of Devonshire had ever made. And he thought about the woman on the ladder. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with fascination, not with the coy, calculated interest that women in London deployed when they found dangerous men attractive. She had looked at him the way one looks at a fact, directly, without embellishment, with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that the fact existed and the equally clear-eyed judgment that the fact was unfortunate. He went back the next day. He told himself it was for the book. He told himself that the Wordsworth had been an impulsive purchase and that what he really needed was a history, something substantial, something worthy of a gentleman's library, something that justified a second visit to a bookshop he had no reason to revisit. He bought a history. He also talked to Evelyn for 45 minutes about whether Napoleon had been a liberator or a tyrant, a conversation that began when he mentioned the military strategy section and ended when Evelyn, who had read every book in her father's shop at least once, presented an argument so nuanced and so thoroughly supported by evidence that Thomas found himself, for the first time in a conversation with a woman, not performing. Not charming, not posturing, not deploying the arsenal of wit and danger that he used in London the way a peacock uses its tail. Simply talking, simply thinking out loud, testing ideas, receiving counter-arguments, adjusting his position. The basic, vital, deeply satisfying work of two minds engaging with each other as equals. For the next 2 weeks, he returned every day, buying books he didn't need just to talk to her. He bought Wordsworth, he bought Coleridge, he bought a treatise on agriculture that he would never read, and a volume of sermons that he would never open, and a collection of botanical illustrations that he examined with feigned interest. While Evelyn, who was not fooled, watched him from behind the counter with an expression that was part amusement and part something else, something warmer, something that she did not yet have a name for. Evelyn never flinched at his reputation. The reputation preceded him into every conversation. The villagers who came into the shop while Thomas was there lowered their voices and widened their eyes and performed the small, unconscious rituals of fear that his presence always produced. But Evelyn did not lower her voice. She did not widen her eyes. She treated Thomas Ashbury, the Devil of Devonshire, the most feared man in the county, the same way she treated every other customer, with a brisk, honest, unperformative directness that refused to acknowledge the possibility that she should be afraid. This was not bravery. Evelyn would not have described it as bravery, because bravery implies the overcoming of fear, and Evelyn was not afraid. She was not afraid because she saw what other people did not see, the thing behind the performance. She saw the devil, and she saw Thomas, and she understood that the two were not the same person. The devil was a costume. Thomas was the man wearing it, and the man wearing it was tired and lonely and hungry for something that the costume could not provide. She argued with him about philosophy, challenged his cynicism, and slowly chipped away at the ice around his heart. The arguments were magnificent. They were the best part of Thomas's day. The hour or two he spent in the bookshop, standing among the shelves while Evelyn shelved books or helped customers or performed the dozen daily tasks that kept the business running, and they argued. They argued about philosophy, whether human nature was fundamentally good or fundamentally self-interested. A debate that Thomas took the cynical side of and Evelyn took the hopeful side of, and neither of them won because the debate was not about winning. It was about connection. It was about the particular intimacy that develops between two people who disagree passionately and who find, in the disagreement, a form of closeness that agreement could never produce. She challenged his cynicism. This was her most effective weapon. Not agreement, not sympathy, not the soft, accommodating responses that other women had offered him. Challenge. Direct, uncompromising, intellectually rigorous challenge that forced Thomas to defend positions he had never been asked to defend, and that crumbled, one by one, under the pressure of Evelyn's quiet, persistent logic. "You say human nature is selfish," she said one afternoon. "But you've been coming to this shop every day for 2 weeks, buying books you don't read, just to talk to me. That's not selfishness. That's loneliness. And loneliness is not cynicism's friend. It's its opposite. A cynical man doesn't need anyone. You very clearly do." Thomas had no answer for this. He had no answer because it was true. And the truth, when delivered by a bookseller's daughter standing behind a counter in a shop that smelled of old paper and new ink, was harder to deflect than any sword. She slowly chipped away at the ice around his heart. Not with warmth. Evelyn was not warm, not in the conventional, feminine, soft-voiced way that warm implied. She was sharp. She was honest. She was the intellectual equivalent of a chisel, precise, focused, applied with care to the exact point where the ice was thinnest. Thomas felt it. He felt the chipping. He felt the ice. The cold, protective layer that the Earl's silence had built, and that the duels had reinforced, and that the reputation had made permanent, beginning to fracture. He felt it, and he was terrified, because beneath the ice was the thing the ice had been protecting, the soft, vulnerable, desperately lonely man who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be seen by someone who was not afraid of what they saw. Evelyn saw him. She saw him the way she saw everything, directly, without flinching, with the honest attention of a woman who had spent her life reading and who understood that the most important text is the one that people carry inside them, the one that is never printed but is always legible if you know how to look. 2 weeks. 14 days of books and arguments and the slow, magnificent demolition of the Devil of Devonshire by a bookseller's daughter who refused to be impressed by him. Thomas was, by the end of the second week, something he had not been since before his father died. Happy. The happiness was unfamiliar. It sat oddly on him, like a coat he had not worn in years, but it was unmistakable, and the servants at Thornbury Hall, who had been watching their master with the careful attention of people whose employment depended on his moods, noticed the change with the relieved astonishment of people who had been expecting a storm and received sunlight instead. Then the challenge came. Sir Marcus Vale was a neighbouring landowner, a man of modest title and immodest ambition, who had been nursing a grudge against Thomas for 3 years. The grudge was about a horse, a stallion that Thomas had purchased at auction, outbidding Sir Marcus by a margin so large that it constituted, in Sir Marcus's view, a deliberate insult. It was not a deliberate insult. Thomas had simply wanted the horse and had the money to pay for it. But Sir Marcus was a man whose ego was as fragile as his fortune was small, and the auction had embedded itself in his pride like a splinter that he could not remove. Sir Marcus had been waiting for an opportunity. He had been watching Thomas's return to Devonshire with the particular attention of a man who has identified a target and is choosing his moment. And the moment, he decided, was now. Thomas was in the county. Thomas was accessible. And Sir Marcus, who had been drinking and brooding and polishing his grievance for 3 years, was ready. The challenge was delivered in the traditional manner. A letter, brought by Sir Marcus's second, demanding satisfaction for an insult that Sir Marcus described in elaborate and largely fictional terms. The letter was formal. The terms were standard. The date proposed was 3 days hence. The weapons were to be pistols. Thomas received the letter at Thornbury Hall on a Tuesday evening. He read it with the detached professional interest of a man who had received such letters before and who understood the mechanics. The seconds, the location, the weapons, the particular choreography of aristocratic violence that England had perfected over centuries. His first instinct was to accept. The instinct was reflexive, automatic. The muscle memory of a man who had been accepting challenges his entire adult life. Accept, prepare, appear at dawn, fire or slash, win, go home, add another story to the legend. The process was familiar. The process was easy. The process was the thing Thomas knew how to do better than anything else in the world. But the instinct was immediately followed by something else. A hesitation. A pause. A small, unfamiliar resistance in his chest that felt like the beginning of a question he had never asked himself before. Why? Why accept? Why fight another man over a horse that Thomas had already forgotten about? Why risk his life, or take another man's, for a grudge that was someone else's? Why add another duel to the legend when the legend was the thing that kept him lonely? The question surprised him. It surprised him because it had never occurred to him before. Not before the first duel, not before the second, not before the third. He had never asked why, because the answer had always been obvious, because honour demanded it. Because his class demanded it, because the alternative, refusing, backing down, being seen as a coward, was unthinkable. But the answer was not obvious anymore. The answer had been destabilized by 2 weeks of conversations in a bookshop with a woman who challenged his cynicism and chipped away at his ice, and who had, without intending to, shown him that the life he had been living, the violent, lonely, performance-driven life of the Devil of Devonshire, was not the only life available. He accepted the challenge. He accepted because the muscles moved before the question could finish, because the reflex was stronger than the hesitation, because 32 years of training could not be overridden by 2 weeks of conversation. But he accepted with a feeling he had never had before. Doubt. The news reached Evelyn the next morning. It reached her the way all news reached Ashbourne, through the network of servants and tradespeople and village gossips who constituted the county's informal communication system. Mrs. Harding, the baker's wife, told Evelyn when she came in for her morning bread. "The devil's fighting again," Mrs. Harding said, with the particular relish that gossips bring to the delivery of dramatic news. Sir Marcus Vale challenged him. Pistols at dawn, Thursday. Evelyn received this information with a stillness that Mrs. Harding found unsettling. She did not gasp. She did not exclaim. She did not perform the expected response of a woman hearing that a man she knew was going to risk his life in 2 days. She simply stood behind the counter with a loaf of bread in her hands and looked at nothing. And the nothing she was looking at was the future. The future in which Thomas Ashbury, the man who bought books he didn't read and argued about philosophy, and who was, beneath the ice and the reputation and the terrible name, the most interesting person she had ever met, went out at dawn and killed a man, or was killed by one, and either outcome was a waste so enormous that the contemplation of it made her chest hurt. She spent the day in the shop. She served customers and shelved books and managed accounts and did all the things she always did, and beneath the doing, she thought. She thought with the same focused, analytical intensity she brought to everything, the same intensity that had catalogued her father's chaotic inventory and balanced the shop's impossible books, and constructed the arguments that had, over 2 weeks, dismantled the Devil of Devonshire piece by piece. She was thinking about what to do, not whether to do something. That was already decided. She was going to do something because the alternative, sitting in her shop and waiting to hear whether the man she loved was dead or alive, was unacceptable. Evelyn Grace, who had never attended a ball, who had never left Devon, who had never done anything dramatic or dangerous or socially inappropriate in her 23 years of quiet, book-surrounded life, was going to do something, and the something was going to be the most reckless act she had ever committed. She waited until midnight. She waited because she was Evelyn, practical, methodical, a woman who planned even her reckless acts with the care and precision that she brought to inventory management. She put on her cloak. She took a lantern. She walked through the dark Devon lanes to Thornbury Hall, a distance of 2 miles, and the walk was long and cold and lit by stars, and she used the time to rehearse what she was going to say, and the rehearsal was unnecessary because she already knew exactly what she was going to say. She had known since the moment Mrs. Harding told her the news. When a jealous rival challenged Thomas to yet another duel, Evelyn did something no one expected. She walked into the Devil's Manor at midnight, stood in front of him, and said, "If you fight tomorrow, I will never speak to you again." The servants did not stop her. Later, they would not be able to explain why. The Devil of Devonshire's household was not in the habit of admitting unannounced visitors at midnight, particularly young women in cloaks carrying lanterns. But there was something about Evelyn, something in her bearing, in the set of her jaw, in the particular quality of determination that radiated from her small, book-stained, entirely formidable person that made the footman who answered the door step aside without a word, and the butler who encountered her in the corridor point toward the library without being asked. Thomas was in the library. Of course he was in the library. It was the room where he had been spending his evenings since arriving in Devonshire, sitting in the leather chair by the fire with the Wordsworth he had bought on his first visit to the shop, reading the poems and thinking about the woman who had sold them to him. He was not reading now. He was sitting with the book closed in his lap and a glass of brandy in his hand, and he was staring at the fire. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is about to do something he no longer wants to do and who cannot find the way to stop. Evelyn stood in front of him. She stood between him and the fire, blocking the light, and her shadow fell across him. And the shadow was the shadow of a small woman in a cloak who had walked 2 miles in the dark to say 7 words. "If you fight tomorrow, I will never speak to you again." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. The moment lasted long enough for both of them to understand what was happening. They were standing at the pivot point of 2 lives, the point where the trajectory either continues or changes, where the future is either the same as the past or different. Thomas was looking at Evelyn and seeing in her face the thing he had been searching for since the first day in the bookshop, the thing that the books and the arguments and the slow chipping of ice had been building toward. He was seeing a person who was not afraid of him, who did not want anything from him, who was standing in his library at midnight, not because she was impressed by his title or attracted to his danger, but because she cared whether he lived or died. And the caring was so simple and so genuine and so devoid of any motive beyond itself that it cut through every defense he had ever built. She was asking him to choose, not between the duel and her. That was the surface of the demand. She was asking him to choose between the devil and Thomas, between the performance and the person, between the life that his father's silence had created and the life that her honest, unflinching, chisel-sharp presence had begun to make possible. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then cancelled the duel, the first time in his life he had ever backed down. He wrote the letter that night, a brief, formal letter to Sir Marcus's second, withdrawing from the engagement. The language was correct. He did not apologize, because apology would have implied fault, and the quarrel was not his. He simply withdrew. He set down his pen and looked at the letter, and understood that the act of writing it, the simple, unglamorous, unwitnessed act of writing 6 lines on a piece of paper, was the bravest thing he had ever done. The duels had not been brave. He saw that now. The duels had been easy. The physical risk was real, but the emotional risk was 0, because winning a duel cost him nothing. He walked onto the field, and he fought, and he won, and he went home, and nothing changed. The ice stayed. The loneliness stayed. The devil stayed. The duels were not courage. They were avoidance. They were the most spectacular possible way of not dealing with the thing that actually frightened him, which was not a sword or a pistol, but the possibility of being known by another person, and found, when known, to be enough. Evelyn had asked him to be brave, not the dual brave, the easy brave, the brave that London applauded and Devon feared. The real brave. The brave of a man who puts down his sword and stands defenseless and says, "I am not the devil. I am Thomas." And Thomas is afraid. He had put down the sword. He had written the letter. He was, for the first time in his life, defenseless. And the defenselessness felt not good, exactly. Not comfortable, but true. It felt true in the way that Evelyn's words always felt true. Sharp, uncomfortable, impossible to argue with. He did not sleep. He sat in the library and watched the fire die and thought about the morning. The next morning, he went to her father's shop, not as the Devil of Devonshire, but as a man asking for her hand. He walked. He did not ride. Riding was the devil's mode of transport, fast and dramatic and designed to be noticed. Thomas walked. 2 miles through the Devon lanes in the morning light, past the hedgerows and the stone walls and the fields where the tenants' sheep grazed and the birds sang, and the world, which had been dark and cold the night before when Evelyn had walked the same route in the opposite direction, was now bright and gentle and astonishingly, almost painfully, beautiful. He arrived at the bookshop at 9 o'clock. The bell chimed. Evelyn was behind the counter, where she always was, and her father was in the back room, where he always was, examining a new acquisition with the absorbed joy of a man who had found another book he would refuse to sell. Evelyn looked up. She saw Thomas in the doorway. Not the devil, not the performance, but the man. The man who had cancelled a duel and written a letter and walked 2 miles in the morning light to stand in her shop and say something he had never said before. He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. He did not perform any of the elaborate, scripted gestures that proposals were supposed to involve. He simply stood in the doorway of the tiny bookshop, with the morning light behind him, and the smell of old paper around him. And he said what he had been wanting to say since the first day, since the moment she had looked down at him from the ladder and told him he didn't need another reason to spill blood. "I am not the man people think I am," he said. "I have done terrible things. I have hurt people. I have spent my life performing a version of myself that I am ashamed of. But you looked at me and saw through it. From the first moment. From the ladder. You saw the man, not the devil, and you spoke to the man, and the man who has been hiding behind the devil for years, is standing in front of you now, and he is asking you to let him stay." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him with the same clear, sharp, honest gaze she had been looking at him with for 2 weeks. The gaze that did not flinch, did not soften, did not perform. She saw the man. She had always seen the man. That was the gift she had given him. The simple, devastating gift of seeing him clearly and treating what she saw not as a threat, but as a person. "Stay," she said. He stayed. He asked for her hand. He asked Robert Grace, who emerged from the back room with a volume of Gibbon under one arm and a bewildered expression on his face, for permission to marry his daughter. Robert, who was not entirely clear on who Lord Ashbury was, and who was not entirely sure he wanted to know, looked at Evelyn. "Do you want this?" he asked her. "Yes, father." "Is he kind?" "He is learning to be." Robert considered this. Then he said, "A man who is learning to be kind is better than a man who has never needed to learn." And he shook Thomas's hand. And the handshake was the handshake of a man who did not care about titles or reputations, or the elaborate social arithmetic that determined who was worthy of whom. He cared about his daughter. His daughter wanted this man. The man was learning to be kind. That was enough. The bookseller's daughter tamed the devil. They married in the village church, the same church where Evelyn had been christened, where her mother had been buried, where the vicar, who had known her since infancy, performed the ceremony with the teary-eyed joy of a man who had watched a girl grow into a woman and was now watching her choose her future. Thomas wore a plain coat, not his finest, not the elaborate, expensive, intimidating wardrobe of the Devil of Devonshire. A plain coat, clean and well made, and entirely unremarkable. He wore it because Evelyn had taught him, through 2 weeks of arguments and a single midnight visit, that the surface is not the substance, and that a man who dresses to intimidate is a man who is afraid of being seen without his armor. Evelyn wore a dress she had made herself. White cotton, simple, with a sprig of lavender tucked into the bodice because her mother had carried lavender at her wedding, and Evelyn wanted her mother present in the only way that was possible. The guests were few. The ceremony was brief. The vows were spoken in steady voices, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the congregation, which was small and consisted mostly of villagers who had known Evelyn her entire life, applauded, which was not strictly traditional, but which felt, under the circumstances, absolutely right. And the man who once lived for violence spent the rest of his life protecting the woman who taught him that some battles are won by choosing peace. He did not go back to London. He did not attend the season. He did not accept the invitations that continued to arrive. Invitations from hostesses who wanted the thrill of the devil at their tables, from men who wanted the cachet of his company, from the social world that had created and sustained and profited from the performance he had spent his life giving. He stayed in Devon. He managed the estate, properly, personally, with the same focused intelligence he had once directed toward violence. He repaired the tenants' cottages. He improved the drainage. He invested in new farming methods. He became, to the astonishment of everyone who had known the devil, a good landlord, attentive, fair, present in a way his father never had been. He read. This was Evelyn's doing. She had filled Thornbury Hall's library with the books she chose for him, and the books she chose were not the military manuals and fencing treatises that the devil would have read, but philosophy and poetry and natural history, the books that fed the mind rather than the ego. Thomas read them with the voracious appetite of a man who has been starving for intellectual nourishment and has suddenly been given a feast, and the reading changed him. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, the way water changes stone, through the persistent, patient application of something gentle to something hard. He never duelled again. The reputation faded. The name, the Devil of Devonshire, was still spoken, but it was spoken differently now, not with fear. With something more like wonder. The wonder of people who had watched a man transform, who had seen the ice crack and the devil shed its skin and the person beneath emerge. Not perfect, not saintly, not the opposite of what he had been, but better, more honest, more present, more kind. Evelyn ran the bookshop. She ran it with the same competence she had always brought to it, and Thomas helped. Not with the business, which he did not understand, but with the heavy lifting, the deliveries, the physical work that the shop required and that Evelyn had been doing alone for years. He carried boxes. He shelved books. He stood behind the counter when Evelyn was busy and sold books to customers who were still, years later, startled to find the Devil of Devonshire wrapping their purchases in brown paper and asking if they'd like anything else. They argued. They never stopped arguing. About philosophy, about politics, about whether Shakespeare was greater than Milton, which Evelyn maintained, and Thomas disputed with the same fervour he had once brought to sword fights. The arguments were the engine of their marriage, the heat that kept the house warm, the friction that kept the blades sharp, the constant, joyful, intellectually rigorous clash of two minds that had found their match. They were happy. Not the dramatic, performative happiness of the London season, not the happiness that requires an audience. The quiet happiness. The Devon happiness. The happiness of two people who had found each other in a bookshop and had built, from books and arguments, and the slow, patient work of dismantling a reputation and building a life. Something that was stronger than the devil and more enduring than any duel. Some battles are won with swords, some are won with pistols, some are won by the particular kind of courage that does not fight at all, that puts down the weapon and stands defenseless, and says, "I am not the man you think I am. I am the man who walks 2 miles to buy books he doesn't read, just to hear your voice." The Devil of Devonshire died in a bookshop on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Thomas Ashbury, the man who replaced him, lived a very long time. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Jane Tells Stories and hit the bell. A new, untold Regency love story arrives every week. Tell me in the comments, was Evelyn right to give him that ultimatum? And do you believe the most dangerous men can be changed by the right kind of honesty? Until next time. This has been Jane Tells Stories.